So this is lecture number 3 for Western Civ 2. We are continuing our discussion of the Cold War. And in the first lecture, I talked about Eastern Europe and how the Soviets had set up communist puppet states there in the year or two immediately following the Second World War. And in the last little lecture, I talked about Germany, how the Soviets had refused to accept the Western vision of an industrially restored Germany, that they'd wanted a agricultural wasteland, basically, like something out of the Middle Ages in the heart of Europe, and that would not do. And these tensions would boil over in the years following World War II and create the high degree of tension that we call the Cold War. I mentioned to you Winston Churchill's famous Iron Curtain speech late in 1946. He wasn't the only person, though, who saw what the Soviets were doing and was very concerned. The spread of communism into Eastern Europe, their attempt to snag a good portion of Germany and incorporate it into that Soviet empire-like structure. Deeply worried a diplomat, an American diplomat stationed in Moscow named George Kennan, Kennan. George Kennan had observed Stalin up close and personal throughout much of the war. And his conclusion was that the Soviets would expand as far as the West would let them. He wrote a long note, and it would be telegrammed back to Washington, D.C., back to the State Department in D.C., and it was very long, but they sent it by telegram, so it's known as the Long Telegram. He would later summarize this in an article published in Foreign Affairs magazine known as the X article. He published it anonymously under the name X. So the X article, or the Long Telegram, laid out a very important idea. It's the idea of containment. Containment is what you need for your notes. Kennan's idea was the Soviets were an inherently expansionistic state, and as long as they met little or no resistance, they would continue to expand into new territory. But he thought they didn't have a strong desire for conflict with the West. After all, they had suffered somewhere well in excess of 20 million people killed in the Second World War. Their European heartland had been decimated. The country was a mess. They weren't really in a great place to fight a war against the major powers of the Western world. He thought that if we resisted them, they would pull back. And so he came up with the idea of containment. When we detected the Soviets trying to push out of their present sphere, wherever they presently were, if they tried to insinuate themselves into a new country, if we would take steps to push back against them, he thought we would stop them. It's a little bit like if you had a wind-up rabbit like in the old Energizer Bunny ads, that it would just keep going, but if you put your foot down in front of the wind-up bunny, it'll stop and go some other direction. So he knew this was going to mean constant vigilance for the United States. We were going to constantly have to be engaged around the world, but he thought if we could put our foot down, that the Soviets would not push us too far, that they didn't want war with us, and if we would just be vigilant and wise, that we could keep Soviet-style communism from expanding through the policy of containment. Incidentally, Kennan thought that a lot of this could be done with money and influence rather than military power. He wasn't envisioning sending the U.S. military all over the earth constantly to stand up to Soviet expansionism. He thought that if we, funded countries around the globe who were threatened by the Soviet Union, that they could build up their own militaries, they could, improve a lot of their own citizens enough that it wouldn't be fertile territory for Soviet expansionism. So he hoped that it wouldn't be a shooting situation at all, or even that we would have to send a lot of our troops around the world to manage containment. He thought other nonviolent means, more soft power, as we'd call it today, might stop the Soviet expansionism. This had a concomitant theory that developed. It's known as the Domino Theory. That's another key term for your notes. The Domino Theory would guide much of American thinking during the Cold War, both containment and the domino theory. And this is, you've all done this, I'm sure, lined up a bunch of dominoes side by side. You push one domino, it hits the next and the next and the next, and just the whole row goes down. Well, policymakers in D.C. thought that that's what would happen if we let communism expand. That communism, if allowed to expand into country A, would pretty quickly subvert country B, and country B would fall to communism, and then its neighboring country C, and then neighboring country D, and so on, like dominoes in a series. And so you had people saying with sincerity, if we don't stop them in Vietnam, pretty soon they'll be in Australia, and then they'll be in Hawaii, and then they'll be in California. It's a little hard for us today to really take that degree of domino theory seriously, but it's not crazy to think that a country like Vietnam would lead to Cambodia going communist, Laos going communist. That actually did happen, but it never expanded beyond, into Thailand or Burma, or certainly not into Indonesia and the like. So, we don't really have many cases where the domino theory proved in the history to be actually accurate, but it was a concern, and that was part of what drove our desire to stay actively involved. We can't let one country go communist because then 10 more might follow in rapid succession. The domino theory and containment drove American policy. Because of the concerns by 1947 that had been raised, the Soviet Union establishing its client states in Eastern Europe, essentially a Soviet empire. They're clearly moving towards establishing a communist state in Eastern Germany. Their funding of communist rebels against the British-backed government of Greece. All these things really got people worried in Washington. And it was decided that although we had just finished ending our involvement in World War II a year and a half earlier, in 1947, we were going to have to start ramping up our military again, getting ready potentially to fight the Soviet Union. The result would be the National Defense Act of 1947. This would reorganize our military. It would create the Air Force as a separate branch of the military. The War Department and the Navy Department would be combined to create the Defense Department we know now. The CIA would be created, several other agencies, the NSA. All these things that are part of our national security apparatus today got their basic shape in the National Security Act of 1947, which also created the National Security Council. The National Security Council is the body of officials that advises the president most directly. The National Security Advisor is one of his top aides on national security, along with the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, the Director of the CIA, and so on. So that was created in 1947. So that's the American side of the equation. On the Soviet side of the Cold War, Stalin, paranoid as always, was constantly on his guard lest somebody try to subvert him. But he did very much want. He was a true believer in his style of communism. He wanted to make the world communist. It's clear that he did. And so he began to stick as many fingers in foreign pies as possible to try to foment revolution in those places. One of those places was Greece. You remember I mentioned that in the later stages of World War II, the British had invaded Greece and driven the Nazis out of Greece. They had set up a government, a very conservative monarchist government in Greece, and a lot of people there didn't want that. They saw it as a foreign imposition, a British imposition, and there was an uprising against this new government, largely led by communists, and Stalin began sending them weapons. So the British began funding the government in Athens heavily. They sent troops to help train and equip the Greek army that was fighting these rebels. But unfortunately, World War II had bankrupted Great Britain. They didn't have the money to keep it up. And in 1947, March of 1947, the British announced they could no longer support the Greek government. And there was a real fear it might fall to communism. that would strategically was significant because if they could get control of Greece, their ships that were in the Black Sea, which is off of the coast of Ukraine and Russia in the south, could potentially get through into the Mediterranean. Soviet ships, warships, could maybe move. All they need to do is take Turkey, and they could move freely into the Mediterranean, which worried the Western Allies a lot. So the United States decided to back Greece and Turkey to keep communism out. President Harry Truman would announce what became known as the Truman Doctrine. It was the idea that the United States would offer financial assistance, weaponry, and, if necessary, troops of our own to help a country stave off communist subversion. So this was the containment theory in practice. But it is a commitment of the United States that if you are a non-communist government and you are in danger of being subverted by communist rebels, we will help you. We will send you money. We will send you weapons. We will send you soldiers if we have to. But we will do what it takes to defend freedom from communist aggression. And Greece and Turkey were the first beneficiaries in 1947 of that. But it really was the beginning of something much bigger. George C. Marshall, who had been chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff during the Second World War, one of the leading military officials in the U.S. military during the Second World War, after his retirement became Secretary of State to Harry Truman's presidency. And Secretary of State Marshall, who, of course, had spent a lot of time in Europe after the war, realized how desperate the situation there was. Millions of people still not properly housed, millions of people without decent paying jobs, food shortages. When he looked at the situation in Europe, he said, these populations are rife to go to communism. They don't see any future in a liberal democracy and free market capitalism in this chaos after World War II in Western Europe. So George Marshall proposed, and Harry Truman accepted, a remarkable plan. It's known today as the Marshall Plan because he came up with it. But it was the idea that the United States would give, as a free gift, enormous amounts of money to Western Europe and to Central Europe, billions of dollars in money and in equipment, farm equipment, in food aid, tens of billions of dollars. And that was back when $1 billion was a lot of money, more than it is now. And the United States gave this as a free gift. We also made very low-interest loans to Western European countries on very good terms for very long payoffs. So what we were doing was trying to prop up Western Europe so that it would not be a breeding ground for communism, that people there would have hope for the future, that they would be able to get decent jobs that paid well, that they would believe that democracy could work because we required them to be liberal democratic governments before we give them money. Incidentally, we offered to the Soviets, too, if they would clean their act up into their puppet states in Eastern Europe, but they all turned it down. But Western Europe would use this aid to blossom again. Within 5 years, most Western European and Central European countries that took the aid were doing much, much better. After the devastation of World War II, by 1955, most of those places were well on the way to decent recoveries and even flourishing. Germany was already beginning to flourish in the West, not the Communist East, but in the West, due to the Marshall Plan. So that takes us up near to the end of the 1940s, but 1949 is going to be a big year. I'll save that for my next little lecturette. Tune in soon. Goodbye.